Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to answer one of the really interesting questions we always get, and I'm going to go ahead and entertain that question. And that question is, if you could only do one exercise for the rest of your life, what would it be? So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And I want people to understand that this is a thought experiment. Because obviously the question itself is ludicrous, because why would we ever limit ourselves to one exercise? There's obviously no reason that we would, right? No reason that we would. And if I were to give a literal answer and take the question really literally, be like, well, why would I do that? And people would say, well, let's say there's a guy holding all your loved ones hostage, and if you ever get seen doing any exercise with the one you pick, they're going to kill him. I'm like, one exercise I would do would be a trigger pull. And I would shoot the guy keeping my family hostage, and then I would go on to do 5 or 6 exercises every week for the rest of my life. Problem solved, right? But that doesn't get to the core of the problem, because it's not meant to be a literal question. What people are really looking for is, hey, what exercise gives you the most bang for your buck? Now, I'm going to get into that in a minute too, of why that question is really ludicrous. But the thing is, the thought experiment itself, if you sit back and think about it, will tell you a lot about training, because it will force you to analyze it. Because we would look at it and say, I don't know, what exercise is going to give me the most bang for my buck? Am I trying to gain the most muscle, the most fitness, the most functional strength? What am I trying to get out of this? Man, I probably want to look somewhat like I lift. Also, I can't just deadlift. Deadlift would probably give me a lot of muscle for one movement, probably the most. But I may not look like I lift, because it won't hit the chest and the triceps and the delts and things like that. It's going to hit almost everything else. So we look at that and say, well, that's not really going to work. Then we start saying, well, what exercise incorporates enough movement patterns that we would classify it as one exercise, but it would work the most muscles through the body, both upper and lower? All right, that's where we could take the thought experiment. And I would have to pin it down to the clean and press. The clean and push press, very specifically. And I'd go so far as to say that if a person was somehow forced through some illusionary, bizarre constraints by aliens or God or something, some sacred oath they took to God, or aliens forced them, some bizarre hypothetical, if that's all you did and you got really strong at the clean and push press, and you did that exercise for a fair amount of volume 3, 4, 5 days a week, you would actually be surprised. You would probably get more jacked than if you just sat around training on machines. I actually believe that's the case. If that one exercise, you would get relatively jacked. However, you wouldn't get as jacked as if you did 4 or 5 different exercises and train them maximally. You could probably get to about 80-90% of your maximum level of jactitude doing that. But you wouldn't be able to reach your max potential. But you could get reasonably close. You'd have a few lagging muscle groups out of balance. But overall, everything would get worked. It's just that everything wouldn't be worked maximally. At least not enough to stimulate maximum growth. It would stimulate pretty decent muscle growth over the years in every single muscle. And why? Because it incorporates 4 different movements. And in fact, I would say when we start talking about movements, there's a degree of overlap. But I would say if you want to maximally develop 90+% of the muscles in your body, right? You want to surpass 90% of your total size and strength potential, you probably need to get very, very strong with very significant workload, because it is workload that induces hypertrophy. People need to understand tension is where you get most of your strength, and then total work done is where you get hypertrophy. Obviously, that's not an absolute statement either. That's loose parameters with a large degree of overlap. All right, and those 6 basic movement patterns are a vertical push, right? A vertical press, a horizontal push, a horizontal press. So press, vertical pull, and a horizontal pull. So again, if people are not understanding, pull, right? Perfect examples: bench press and an overhead press, a barbell row and a chin up. right? And you have a hip hinge and a squat, right? Those six, you got 6 basic movement patterns. If you picked a good exercise, particularly a lot of exercises where you're standing on your feet, and you got good at 6 exercises, one exercise that filled those criteria, and you did enough volume and got strong enough with enough workload, you'd be pretty well developed. You would achieve 90+% of your potential if you got really good at those 6 over the course of about 4 or 5 years. Right? You could get within 90 to 95% of your maximum genetic size and strength potential. Drug-free, obviously, is what I'm talking about. But you need at least those 6. Well, the clean and push press gives us 4, but the problem is that because we're limited to the amount of weight and volume we could do on the easier movement patterns, that'll neglect a little bit of the other 2. Because when you think about it, you're combining a power clean, and a power clean has 2 movements in it, doesn't it? Yeah? There's 2 movements involved. You have both a vertical pull and you have a hip hinge. Then you go into the push press. The push press is what? It's a partial squat. So the problem is it's not a full squat, and it's not going to be enough weight to stimulate maximum muscle fibers, but you will get some leg growth. You will get some leg growth from a push press. It just won't be as much as you get from a squat. But if you get explosive enough at all of it, particularly combining it with the clean, if you can break contact with the floor on your power clean, and then combine that with a solid push press, the dip in the push press, you'll actually get decent leg development. Not going to be as much as if you get to a 450 or 500 squat, but you get some respectable leg development. And then, the push press component itself, the actual overhead press with a heavy weight like that, particularly with the eccentric loading at the bottom, you build your chest, your delts, triceps, all that stuff up. So that'll handle a lot of your show muscles, those aesthetic muscles. I mean, we know that overhead pressing is one of the biggest keys. Standing press in general is what built most of those old school physiques when we think of with the wide shoulders they have, with the upper chest, because they all have good upper chest, solid delt development, big triceps. That exercise played a big role for those guys because they focused really heavily on standing presses. So that combination would get you there. But here's the thing with the thought experiment. The only reason it would work is because it hits at least 4 of our 6 basic movement patterns. Now, it doesn't hit all of them maximally. It only hits a couple of them maximally. Right? Hits a couple of them maximally. But that couple that it hits maximally are muscles that you're going to notice. And that's the thing. It's still going to work every muscle in your body. There's not one muscle in your body that will not get some growth stimulation from that movement. You're just not going to get maximum because, again, you're going to be limited by the workload of the entirety of the movement. But it will work, particularly if you can get explosive enough with it to where you can hit upper threshold fibers even with some of the partial movements involved. It will work. You're just not going to get maximum development. You'll get good development. So it satisfies the criteria, but here's the thing. It's not because that makes it the best exercise. It just makes it a multi-tool exercise. It's like having a Swiss Army knife with a little hammer on it. You'd probably be better if you had a legitimate hammer and a big pack of screwdrivers and everything else to go with your Swiss Army knife that has a little hammer on the end. But you could use that if you had to. But that's the thing, is that it lets us know that, well, it satisfies some criteria. You have four of our 6 movement patterns at least somewhat covered while standing on your feet. Right? It's a big movement. So the thought experiment, what it really tells us is that the best way to get maximally big and strong is to really get good at all of your movement patterns. To pick exercises that hit as many muscle fibers maximally as possible throughout the body. That's how you get big. That's how you get strong. To combine overall strength with speed and explosive movements, axial loading, these things. But it also tells us that we need to understand that we need a variety of movement patterns. And when I say that, I don't mean that we need 6 different types of curls to develop the bicep. Biceps can be maximally developed on one type of curl or even chin-ups. It's not a complex muscle. It isn't. But if we are seeking maximum development, we need to be thinking in terms of movement patterns. And what this experiment does, it makes us really think through, well, how many movement patterns are there? There's 6. Well, how many of them can I hit with one exercise? Can I get a multi-phase exercise that works multiple of those movement patterns and still count it as one exercise? Can we get close enough? And then it will also force you to step back and assess your own training and say, okay, what am I missing in my training? If these 6 movement patterns are the 6 basic unit movements that we would do that incorporate the entire body, and therefore that's how the body is designed to operate, which actually does allow for good hypertrophy, which is why isolation movements in studies don't produce more muscle growth than less ideal compound movements. That's why when you look at studies, lat pull downs cause just as much muscle growth in both novice and intermediate lifters when it's been studied as a bicep curl does. The curl doesn't actually build any more bicep than a lat pull down, and the line of pull on that is not ideal for the bicep because big compounds are just more effective, that you don't have to hit the angles optimally. So we go back and we ask the question of how many movement patterns are there, and is my own training deficient in one of those? Am I missing something? And if I'm missing something, does that explain a gap in my performance or a gap in my overall muscle mass? Is it because I'm missing something fundamental in my training that's part of the normal human movement pattern and set of kinetic chains? What am I missing? And I think it's good for that purpose because it forces us to evaluate that rather than to really say what would be the best exercise, because there's no best exercise. There's no such thing. There are different tools that we have available to us. So that's the beauty of a thought experiment like that. It forces us to ask this question, and then we can use that same thought experiment to say, well, if I was going to be forced to use one exercise, I would need to get one that gets the most movement patterns in so that I could get the most benefit. So why am I not doing that with my current training right now? All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.